Thank you for joining me in this edition of The Inside on Equinoxe Television. We are bringing this program to you from Abuja, federal capital of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, and we're going to be taking a look at the unfolding of the 2023 election of the president, senators, and House representatives. Of course, you already know Bola Tinubu of the APC political party is going to be the new president of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, and he's going to replace Muhammadu Buhari. He emerged a winner in the presidential election. We're going to be looking at the unfolding of that election or the elections and the lessons that Africa can draw from the elections, the 2023 elections in Nigeria, in view of improving democratic processes, improving on the continent's democracy. Meet our guest in some few seconds. Our guest today is Dr. Christopher Famuyo. He's the Senior Associate for Africa, Regional Director of the Washington-based National Democratic Institute for International Affairs, NDI. He's been observing elections across the African continent and in many other parts of the globe. And today we are receiving him in this edition of The Inside. Dr. Christopher Famuyo, thank you for accepting to talk to Equinoxe Television once more.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to meet you here in Abuja, Nigeria, and to say, first of all, how impressed I am that Equinoxe Television understands the importance of these elections in a neighboring country to Cameroon, and the highest populated country on the African continent, and that Equinoxe TV was able to dispatch a crew to cover these elections. So it's my pleasure to meet you here and to talk to you.
There are very high stakes as far as this election is concerned, and of course the democracy of the African continent as a whole.
Yes, there are high stakes in these elections, first for Nigeria, because you know Nigeria is a country of approximately 230 million inhabitants. Nigeria is the highest populated country on the African continent. This country also has 176,000 polling sites with an electorate of 93 million registered voters. So if you take the registered voters of all of West Africa and all of the Central Africa sub-region combined, that would be the electorate that we had to deal with in these elections in Nigeria. We also must remember that this is the 24th year of Nigeria's democracy since the return to civilian democratic rule, since the transition in 1999 that pushed the military to go back to the barracks and to allow for democracy to again take root in this country. So Nigerians are very proud of this track record because it's the longest period in Nigerian history where civilian rule has not been dislocated by the military intervening in the political process. That's also why for these elections, with President Muhammadu Buhari, the incumbent, having served his 2 terms in office, and respecting the constitutional term limits of the country, it opened the space for a new competitive election, and that's why we saw a lot of new candidates and a lot of energy and excitement about these elections.
And whatever is happening in Nigeria today will definitely have some repercussions. It could be positive or negative on the rest of the continent, but more specifically to Cameroon, which is the nearest neighbor to one of the nearest neighbors of the Federal Republic of Nigeria. How important is what is happening in Nigeria to the Republic of Cameroon?
First of all, as we all know, we share the longest border with Nigeria. This is one country that shares the border with 5 of Cameroon's 10 regions, going all the way from the Lake Chad Basin to the Atlantic Ocean. And so what happens here should be of interest to us, because if Nigeria converges into a crisis, a post-election crisis because of dispute over its elections, the overflow of refugees from Nigeria could definitely just undermine further stability in Cameroon. We also know that Nigeria has had all of the continent really focusing on these elections. We had delegations from ECOWAS, which is the Economic Community of West African States, but we also had a very strong and powerful delegation from the African Union, as well as from SADC. Even the Southern Africa Development Community, SADC, sent a delegation to these elections. That for me underscores the importance that all of Africa attaches to the Nigerian elections, and the recognition that if Nigeria, which is the premier African country, does well, then it would confirm the fact that African countries are deepening and strengthening their democracy, that some of the innovations that we're now seeing in electoral processes on the continent, whether it's with independent election commissions running elections, or whether it's with the introduction of innovative technology in the way in which elections are managed, including the counting and transmission of election results, that these elements are really helping strengthen democratic processes on the African continent.
All right, we're going to talk a little more about that shortly in the course of this program. But just to emphasize a little more on the relations between Cameroon and the Federal Republic of Nigeria. The Federal Republic of Nigeria is today hosting thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of refugees from southwest and northwest, people who have fled violence because of the crisis going on in their country, and they are here in the Federal Republic of Nigeria. Whatever happens here is also of prime concern to those Cameroonians who are here and seeking refuge here.
Yes, there are tens of thousands of them. In fact, by the last count, according to the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, there were over 70,000, 80,000. Some people have put the number as high as over 100,000 because some of the refugees that have come over from the northwest and southwest regions because of the conflict, the ongoing Anglophone conflict or Anglophone crisis, have not even yet registered with the UNHCR. And so you find them in some of the cities, firstly in the neighboring states of Nigeria, Cross River State, Akwa Ibom State, Benue State, Taraba State. You find tens of thousands of Cameroonian refugees. And even here in Abuja, in the capital city, there are pockets of this city where you go and you find a lot of Cameroonian refugees. It's very saddening, it's very disheartening, but it's also a reminder of why democracy matters, why open societies, pluralistic societies matter, and why conflicts and crises have to be avoided at all costs because of the deaths and loss of property, but also because of the pain and suffering that ordinary citizens are then exposed to.
And apart from the Cameroonian refugees, there are so many Cameroonians who have been here in Nigeria. Many are still coming in to do business, to study, and to work. And this, whatever happens here in Nigeria, is definitely going to affect them in one way or the other, and even in terms of business, even though the business between Cameroon and Nigeria, especially along the borders, has suffered some a slowdown, especially in the northwest and southwest regions because of the insecurity resulting from the Anglophone crisis, but it will also affect Cameroonians, even in terms of business, private business, and even in terms of the economy of the country.
That's so true, and that's why every Cameroonian should pay attention to the ongoing elections and electoral processes in Nigeria, because there's no doubt in my mind that if you're a neighboring country with 25 million inhabitants and your neighbor has got 10 times the size of your population, that means open opportunities for private sector exchanges. We know that since the conflict in the northwest and the southwest, the gateways of economic activity and even small business between the two countries has been negatively impacted. And so if an election comes on and it goes smoothly, that's good and fine. But where things begin to deteriorate in Nigeria because of the elections or disputes over its outcome, then it would invariably worsen or further deteriorate economic opportunities and exchanges. It would render life really miserable for people, not just from Cameroon, but from other neighboring African countries that in the past years have sought refuge in this country.
We go into the newsstands right now. We want to see what the newspapers reported this week, not in Cameroon, but in the Federal Republic of Nigeria. Immaculate Fogwe with the press review.
The Punch says, Battle Royal, Atiku Abubakar, Bola Tinubu, Peter Obi and others fight for the presidency. According to the Daily Independent, presidential election, 10 parties walk out of collation center and urge poll cancellation. The Guardian states, drama as observers Obasanjo, Abdul Salami query elections. Business Day, PDP, LP, ADC ask INEC chairman to resign. The Nation, presidential poll results, APC and PCC calls for calm. The Daily Times says, African leaders urge peace. They equally met leading presidential candidates.
Back to the presidential election, the election of senators and House representatives. We still have the election of governors that's yet to come. Now, about these three elections that unfolded this week, as someone who has been observing elections in several African countries for so many years, what's your take about the conduct of these elections?
In fact, I've had the good fortune of not only observing elections across this continent, but I should say observing every presidential election that has taken place here in Nigeria since the transition of 1998-1999. And so I have seen the incremental progress that has been made by Nigeria to sanitize its electoral process. I have seen some very bad elections, as we saw in 2007. And I've seen some very good elections, as we saw in 2015, when for the first time an incumbent president lost the election, called his opponent and congratulated him, even before the National Independent Election Commission announced the official results.
That was Goodluck Jonathan.
Indeed, that was when President Goodluck Ebele Jonathan, graciously accepted defeat, called up now incumbent President Muhammadu Buhari and congratulated him. And that was an example to emulate. I also saw in 2019 some of the shortcomings of the election management body at the time. And we all saw how Nigerian civil society, working with some progressive legislators, members of parliament, senators and members of the House, got pushed and advocated for electoral reform. And we saw that in 2022, in February of 2022, Nigeria enacted a new election law that created the framework for better elections. So coming into 2023, there was a lot of hope, there was a lot of optimism. The expectations were very high that the Independent National Election Commission would perform remarkably and probably provide Nigeria with the best elections that it ever had. Unfortunately, I should say today that our delegation, as well as delegations of Nigerian citizens and citizen organizations, have remarked that those expectations were not met and that there were many missed opportunities this time that would have made the elections acceptable to all Nigerians. Unfortunately, that is not the case as we speak at this point.
Right, and we spoke to many Nigerians in Lagos, here in Abuja, and they really expressed disappointment. Many of them were first-time voters, and they told us they have never voted before because of the irregularities that often characterize elections here. And this time they had some hope with the introduction of the use of electronic equipments to register the votes, and of course with a candidate like Peter Obi, who was coming to kind of break what has been the two-party system that's been going on for 24 years. They had hopes, but at the end of the day, they felt that they will not come to vote again. Some of them told us, even if they organize any election tomorrow, they will not come to vote again because they didn't see what they were expecting.
In fact, I must start by commending the Nigerian youth, because we saw that millions of young people in Nigeria actually went through the process of registering and getting their names on the voter rolls. And many of them turned out to cast their ballots. We did state in our statement that recognition and that complementarity, or that those compliments to the Nigerian youth. And I can understand why some of them will be disappointed. Because, for example, the Election Commission had promised that election results will be immediately after the voting closes, after the counting each of the polling units, each of the 176,000 polling units of the country, that those election results will be automatically uploaded onto a server and a platform managed by INEC, a database managed by INEC, but that citizens across the entire country would be able to see and track on a real-time basis. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. And so I can understand why these challenges that were faced by young voters could discourage some of them from having faith in the Election Commission and in the electoral process. But I would at the same time say to these young Nigerians and to young Africans across this continent that democracy is a never-ending endeavor, that you cannot despair after the first phase of challenges. Because if you despair and you opt out of the political process, then people who are less dynamic, less competent, less knowledgeable, less committed to freedoms and to democracy would occupy that vacuum that you leave. So even if you stumble in the first attempt, please come back, stay in the democratic lane, continue to advocate and work hard towards the things you want to see done, and ultimately the good will prevail. My sense is that lessons will be drawn from the mishaps of the 2023 elections, and efforts will be done, or efforts will need to be galvanized to make sure that the next elections are better off than what we've just experienced.
Right. Some of the observers here told us that the delays in the compilation and proclamation of the results, and of course the fact that the results were not transmitted directly into the portal of the Independent National Electoral Commission, as was announced with the use of the BVAS, had a negative impact on the credibility of the elections. Do you think it did?
Yes, I think it did. And the international delegation that was fielded, joined by my organization, the National Democratic Institute, and our sister organization, the International Republican Institute, we also identified that and made that statement very clearly in our preliminary declaration, that the cumulative effect of the late arrival of voting materials, the late arrival of polling officers, the non-transmission of election results in real time as promised by the Independent National Election Commission, that the cumulative effect of all of those challenges may have dampened voter participation and in many ways, pushed a lot of citizens to question their trust and confidence in the election management body.
Even before the proclamation of the final results by INEC, some political party leaders, including leaders of the Labour Party and the PDP, gathered the press and called for a total cancellation of those elections. That they said that with regards to the irregularities and the suspicions of fraud and manipulation of the results by INEC and the violations of the law by INEC, electoral law by INEC, the elections should simply be cancelled and repeated. What do you think about such a call?
Well, I must say that as independent observers, as the electoral process is still ongoing, because it's not over, this is just one phase of the process, and the process is still ongoing, that it would not be appropriate for me to comment on partisan declarations from political party leaders. I can understand their frustration and their expectations not having been met. I also would recognize that even other Nigerian personalities, such as former President Olusegun Obasanjo, also made similar declarations to say that the elections should be rerun. My understanding is that it's a legal framework that defines how grievances around the electoral process should be addressed. And my hope is that ultimately the aggrieved parties, from political parties will take their grievances into the court system, into the legal process, and that their grievances will be properly addressed within that forum. We will continue to monitor the rest of the process and would be able to issue our own declarations as we see fit.
All right. The candidate of the APC, the ruling APC political party, Bola Tinubu, was declared winner of the presidential election by INEC, and followed, of course, by Atiku Abubakar and then Peter Obi. But these results generated some kind of mixed feelings among Nigerians, but many of them were not very happy. They were frustrated because they were expecting a complete change. They were expecting that something new, different from what has been happening with a two-party system for the past 24 years, should come out of these elections. What will you say to these Nigerians who are feeling disappointed about the outcome, the result?
Obviously, you know, the period of the pre-election period in every country, the campaign season before election day, everyone is optimistic because everyone believes their candidate would win. But, you know, politicians and candidates need to come to the realization that at the end of the day, that some of that optimism is going to dissipate because ultimately only one candidate can get elected. I think what really causes the frustration for their supporters is not necessarily only that their candidate didn't win, but that the process of the tabulation and announcements of results may have cast some doubts in their minds as to whether the outcome that has been announced is a true reflection of what transpired on election day. I would also hasten to say, even to the APC, whose candidate is won, that when you look at the official tally of the results, the APC won by about 8 million votes. The PDP came second with about 7 million votes. And Peter Obi, the Labour Party, came third with about 6 million votes. And then there was a fourth party, Gwangwaso, who came next with about 1 million votes. So if you take the totality of the three other major candidates who didn't win the presidency, their vote total is about double the votes earned by the APC, which for me, if I were the APC candidate, would demand a lot of humility, a lot of understanding of the fact that if this were a parliamentary system, we'll all be talking about a minority government, and that Nigeria, to move this country forward with its democracy, they're going to have to reach out and find ways to address the shortcomings that have been demonstrated by these elections, as opposed to being arrogant in victory just because that victory has been announced by the National Independent Election Commission.
How many observers did the NDI deploy, and in how many states in Nigeria? How did the deployment go on? How did the various observers work to be able to bring up with the report that you published?
Well, the National Democratic Institute (NDI) decided this year to have a joint delegation with our sister organization, the International Republican Institute. So the two institutes put together an international delegation of 40 members that represent experts, election experts, political analysts, regional experts from Latin America, Asia, Europe. We even had someone from South Korea, someone from Ukraine, someone from Mexico, a lot of Europeans, North Americans, and people from across the African continent as well. This team of 40 was supported by 6 thematic analysts who had been looking at specific sectorial issues such as women in politics, women in elections, violence around elections, disinformation and social media coverage of campaign periods, the electoral framework and election security. These 6 thematic analysts had been in the country already a month before the international delegation arrived. We had also conducted 2 pre-election assessment missions in July and in November to prepare the groundwork for our international delegation. When the delegation got here, we briefed our delegates, our observers, for 2.5 full days, and then we deployed them. So we were able to deploy in 20 states of the Federation. We couldn't cover all 36 states, obviously. We deployed to 20 states, but we made sure that we had teams in each one of the 6 geopolitical regions of this country. And so that allowed us to have a snapshot of what transpired on election day, and it's on the basis of their findings and what they saw in their deployment states that we were able to put together a preliminary statement, which was released at a press conference on Monday and then shared with all the Nigerian stakeholders, including the Independent National Election Commission, political parties, civil society, the Nigerian media, and the Nigerian people as well.
You certainly noticed the heavy deployment of security forces all around the territory.
Yes, I noticed that, and our observers noticed that in each one of the polling sites that they visited. And for once, I think that was one of the positives that we saw, because for a country that's already grappling with multiple sources of insecurity, it was important that the federal government deploy the police and the military in ways that could guarantee safety for the voters and for poll workers on election day. And that's why, by and large, on a very large scale, for the 176,000 polling units, most of them took place with security services around, even though these security services were not interfering with the voting, but just being present to make sure there was no chaos and that the voting process was not disrupted.
About the security issues in Jos Plateau State and some areas where Boko Haram attacked and destroyed some polling station materials.
Yes, of course. You know, when you're dealing with 176,000 polling units in all 36 states and the Federal Capital Territory, there are bound to be areas, especially in states that were already exposed to incidents of insecurity, whether it's from Boko Haram or from armed banditry or in terms of intercommunal violence, that some of those incidents still had to occur, and we saw some of the images around E-Day. But by and large, in the vast majority of polling stations, voting was able to take place without a lot of disruption.
We're going to take a short break now, and we're bringing to you some few interviews of some Nigerians who are reacting to the unfolding of the elections and, of course, the outcome of the election of the president, senators, and House representatives. And we're also bringing to you some analysis from some civil society leaders and observers here in the Federal Republic of Nigeria.
Most people are kind of disappointed. You know, they were expecting something bad, different from what is happening right now. And people felt like the election was not properly conducted. And they feel like it was, how would I put it? They feel like it was something that was forced on them. You know, people felt like they came out to vote, and this was not what they expected. Whoever has won, but let's just embrace it and give peace a chance. We pray that there will be more security in the country.
All what we are praying for is for better Nigeria. That is what we are praying for, and we are praying that God should give him more wisdom so that we can lead the country well. That is what we are praying.
In fact, that result was so super and is an authentic, because it is not easy. The way we see it is a game of, politics is interest, and it was a very large Nigeria as a whole. Everybody was shaking. You can imagine how even APC lost Lagos and some other prominent states, even Osun State and so on. So even with the lovers of the APC, whatever, so it was so authentic. And some of the strong prominents in Nigerians even lost their seats. So there is a different changes in this 2023 election. In fact, we're so much happy about the way the election was conducted.
By my observation, the result did not reflect the true wishes of the people of Nigerians. That's the truth about that. But on the whole, Tinubu, who has been declared a winner, is a Nigerian also. And I wish that people should back him up and pray for him. He could do better. But the truth about it is that Nigerians, or ordinary Nigeria on the street, is not happy. They are not happy. over the true wishes, because they fear that their wish has been truncated by the so-called INEC and the rest.
And the result of the election, in fact, it's not something that we can proud of it, because what they promise us is not what they deliver, and definitely sure they can never deliver justice. So, and that sentiment, it can bring violence, and we are trying to avoid violence. One of the solutions of stopping problem not to happen is to prevent it. So that's why we are trying our possible best to work to the right path, so that we can be able to get it right. But if we cannot get it right, then I'm sure we cannot do the right thing, and that is the problem we are facing today. You can never get it right until you do the right thing.
A comprehensive audit and investigation to unravel the factors that led to the delay in the upload of election results on the online portal is critical. Persons found complicit in sabotaging the critical aspect of the election should be sanctioned. 2. INEC should clarify the inconsistencies in some of the results, especially presidential election results from Rivers and Imo states. Voting hours should be extended to 5 p.m. to increase voter participation in subsequent elections. Fourthly, legal timelines for testing new electoral technologies should be introduced to Nigeria's electoral legal framework. Fifthly, INEC should provide clarifications on its interpretation of key aspects of the legal framework on issues like results collation and transmission process, the threshold for determining the winner in an election, and the Commission's power to review election results declared under duress or in contravention of the Electoral Act, INEC guidelines and manuals. And finally, INEC should sustain the uploads of polling unit results form EC8A on its IREV portal. In conclusion, once again, the 2023 elections, presidential elections and the National Assembly elections were a missed opportunity, with factors like the serious logistical and technological shortcomings undermining public confidence in INEC and the outcome. Other countries, even large complex ones, are able to have polling units open on time across the entire country, providing everyone with an equal opportunity to vote. Other countries, African countries, have successfully employed technology. Nigeria cannot be an exception.
My first observation is that I want to salute Nigerians for coming out en masse to participate in the process. I think the turnout this time around and the awareness using the social media was very massive, and a lot of Nigerians came out to participate in the process, and there was enthusiasm. Also, considering the recent novel policies, a lot of people wanted to participate to also have a say in government. But unfortunately, the expectations were dashed in most southern part of the country, and then a few places in the north, because the same recurrent problem of the Electoral Commission, the Independent National Electoral Commission, reared its ugly head again, where it became obvious that recurrent logistic problems of arrival of materials, non-functionality of the bimodal verification machines in some areas, and lack of enough manpower to handle the process, also mar, the expectations and the process, and made people, gradually begin to, lose hope in, the outcome.
Those suspects that were appearing before the Mixed Commission decreed by the head of state to investigate the mayhem, some of them were discharged, whereas some of them were moved into the preliminary inquiry phase before the examining magistrate. As soon as they arrive before the examining magistrate, they become defendant. There are no more suspects. So it is important to note that they are there to defend the probable cause that the state prosecutor must have seen in their file as the boss of judicial police, what they call in French indice, meaning that there is some probable reason that they engage in the commission of the offense. At this juncture, the examining magistrate is the boss of the preliminary inquiry. The proceedings will take place in his chamber. The examining magistrate has unfettered powers to charge and to discharge. It is important for your viewers to understand this, that the examining magistrate can discharge and he can equally charge. So as of last evening, they have not been charged. Though they have not been charged. The examining magistrate is the person who is going to establish that is a prima facie case against the defendants before the matter will be forwarded to open court for trial.
The recent incarceration of decision to detain Mr. Mugu Belinga, the patron of Anecdote, and with others who have been guilty, who are involved in the torture and kidnapping of the renowned journalist Martinez Ugo. Well, the news, we have been waiting for that news for some time now. It has taken so much longer. We were expecting this earlier than now, but it's not too late. All what we needed is that justice should be meted on those involved in the assassination of the journalist Martinez Ugo and other related events that has to do with killings. But what beats my imagination is the fact that when I listened to the charges, I just got that they were sent to Kundigi for charges of torture and kidnapping. So I never saw any area where it was written that they were guilty of the killing of the journalist. So it's still so much question still needs to be answered. Who then now is guilty of the killing of Martinez Ugo? So, but all the same, I think we expected more heads to fall. From every indication shows that there's more to this than what we are seeing. Let all those, it should not be partial, all those involved in the assassination of journalist Martinez Ugo and other journalists, including even priests that we have heard of recent assassination, kidnapping and torture, let everybody be brought to book, including even the case of Samuel Wazizi.
What must the new president of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, Bola Tinubu, do to federate Nigerians? All of these people who are having convergent and divergent thoughts and opinions, to federate them together and move the country forward out of all these many problems, including the inavailability of Naira banknotes. That's a major problem today in Nigeria. We have the issues with electricity, inadequate electric energy supply, issues of corruption, and of course, insecurity.
Yes, you're right, because when you look at the inventory list of the challenges that Nigeria faces today, whether they're economic, whether they have to do with monetary policy, They're in the process of changing their currency or meting out new naira notes. The economic issues of security. We know that still the issues of Boko Haram in the northeast. There's armed banditry in most of the northwest. There's intercommunal conflicts in most of the north central. There are even threats of secession in southeast. And so there's a myriad of issues that the next government of Nigeria is going to have to address. The next government that will come out of this election, or that's coming out of these elections, cannot afford to have extreme polarization overlap those other pre-existing challenges and crises. It's going to therefore be incumbent on President-elect Bola Tinubu, if that announcement is not challenged in court. It's going to be incumbent on him to reach out to the other parties and candidates who were in the race to make sure that he can cool down the temperature of the policy, as Nigerians like to say. He doesn't need to heat up the policy even further. He would have to have declarations that are more embracing of the divergence of viewpoints, the diversity that this country knows, and the divergence of viewpoints that have come through these campaign periods. And he has to be able to build bridges to the other 60% or so of Nigerians who did not necessarily vote for him. Because if you had 34% of the electorate, you cannot govern as if all of the electorate voted for you. And I think it's incumbent on him to build those bridges. I would also say to the candidates who didn't make it this time around that fortunately Nigeria has confirmed the fact that they are respectful of their constitutional term limits, that their next elections are going to be in a 4-year period, and 4 years is a very short time to run a presidential campaign. And rather than spend too much time worrying about the losses of the present or of the past, begin to think how they can build on what they've accomplished to then step forward into the arena in the next 3 to 4 years.
And the rotation system between North and South has been respected, as it has been the case as long as we can imagine. But that was in the disfavor of Atiku Abubakar, who has been struggling to become president for at least 6 times. And now, when we look at the number of states won by the different candidates, should the opposition, notably Atiku Abubakar or the PDP and the Labour Party, come together, that would likely mean that the opposition will have a majority in parliament. Will that be a difficult thing to handle for the regime of Bola Tinubu?
Yes, indeed. If the percentage of votes obtained in the presidential race were to translate into the percentage of seats in the Senate and seats in the House of Representatives at the federal level, or were to translate into governorships at the state level, then the politics of Nigeria for the next 3 to 4 years will be fascinating to watch. Because governors have constitutional powers in the Constitution of the Federal Republic that are pretty powerful. On top of that, they are elected, unlike what pertains in almost all Francophone countries, where governors are handpicked or appointed by one individual. In Nigeria, they are elected and so draw their legitimacy from citizens as prescribed in the constitution of the country. And so they can be very powerful political actors, and so are the senators and the members of the House who take their legislative responsibilities very keenly. So if you are a president, duly elected, as Bola Tinubu will be, if you don't recognize that you don't have 100% of the powers of this country, then you could be in for some surprises. And so I would encourage every African, every political scientist, every political junkie, journalist, and everyone who is interested in Nigerian politics to pay attention to the politics of this country for the next 3 to 4 years, and to follow very keenly what will transpire in the upcoming gubernatorial elections on March 11th, as well as the state elections for state representatives into state houses. This could become a very the dynamism that we see in Nigerian society could express itself through these elected new members, and that may create the foundation for a more vibrant and diverse political landscape in Nigeria going forward.
In this regard, what do you foresee as far as the future of Nigeria is concerned?
Well, I would be gratified in seeing, one, that the elections are taking place on time, unlike in previous years when we've had elections postponed at the last minute. Two, that the constitutional timeline for the exercise of political power in Nigeria is being respected. Three, that gentleman's agreement of rotation of political power is being respected in terms of Obasanjo having been a southerner, giving up to Umaru Yar'Adua from the north, and then Goodluck Jonathan from the south, and then Buhari from the north, and now Bola Tinubu from the south, that there's a sense that that rotation of power would send a strong message to all Nigerians across the federation that they do belong and that they have the possibility and the potential to actually be elected to govern this country. That will provide some level of stability. Fourthly, that the dynamism that we've seen amongst the Nigerian people and the show of interest and commitment in democratic and electoral processes would endure, that the work that is being done by Nigerian civil society organizations that have mobilized thousands, tens of thousands of citizen observers to monitor these elections, that have even gone as far as organizing a parallel vote tabulation, and by their own skills and expertise, tracking election results to the point of being able to verify the elections announced by INEC. And as we just saw a few hours ago, coming out with a statement that pinpoint the fact that even though at the federal level, at the national level, the outcome may not have been different, specific elections in the states of Imo State as well as in Rivers State do not reflect what their own findings show. It's an act of courage, but they're doing that because they have the expertise and they're confident that they can, what their declarations can stand the test of time and can even stand the rulings of the courts of law. So all of this positivity, all of these positive attributes need to be harnessed, strengthened, and built upon to make for stronger democracy here in Nigeria. It's also a confirmation that African countries are on the right trajectory, and that even when we see backsliding in countries such as Mali or Burkina Faso or Guinea-Conakry, that these are tides that are trying to reverse the enthusiasm for democracy that the younger generation of Africans aspire to and hopefully will continue to work towards achieving.
Right. We are now opening up on the African continent. This, particularly the presidential election, was the tightest election that Nigeria has seen since the end of military rule in 1999. What can Africa pick out as lessons from this election, considering the fact that the African continent is having a more or less limping democracy, especially the Francophone African countries, where we have protests. Every election we have protests and a lot of irregularities that are recorded here and there. What lessons can Africa as a whole pick out of these elections in Nigeria?
Well, first of all, I was very pleased to see the number of former African heads of states that were here in Nigeria to monitor the elections, or to be at the head and the leadership of various international election observation missions. We had former President Thabo Mbeki of South Africa, who was heading the Commonwealth delegation. We had former President Uhuru Kenyatta of Kenya, who was heading the African Union delegation. We had former President Ernest Bai Koroma of Sierra Leone, who was heading the ECOWAS delegation. We also had former President John Mahama of Ghana, who was here as part of an initiative launched and spearheaded by former Nigerian President Goodluck Jonathan, of eminent personalities. In fact, that included the former Vice President of the Gambia, Madam Tambajang. We had the former President of Malawi, Dr. Joyce Banda, who was the head of our own delegation, the joint delegation fielded by NDI and the IRI sister organization. So for me, that was not only a testament to the fact that there's life after State House, but also a willingness on the part of these former African leaders, or former African presidents, to show to other African leaders that you can still continue to contribute to the development of this continent without necessarily being in State House. That it's life after State House, and you can do good things that lay the foundation for a better future for this continent than what you may have inherited. That's the first lesson that I draw from that, and that I hope that the rest of the continent will be drawing from the Nigerian experience. The second lesson for me is that you can see that there's a thirst, there's a hunger across this continent for democracy and good governance. And this is coming, the Nigerian elections are coming after what we saw in Kenya, where a younger candidate who had fallen out with his president, who was his boss, and went up against a powerful coalition of his president and the main opposition candidate. And nobody gave President Ruto in Kenya a chance, or candidate Ruto a chance, because he was running against his president and the main opposition candidate Raila Odinga. And yet he was able to prevail because younger Kenyans said, we've had enough of these dynasties, the Kenyatta and the Odinga dynasties, and we want a new face. We want new people who can come with new ideas. And they went for the younger candidate. And here we've seen in Nigeria that a third force emerged, and in less than 1 year was able to garner between 25 and 30% of the electorate. That is quite powerful. That is very powerful. And for me, it's a strong message that the Africans of the younger generation want something different.
You're talking there about Peter Obi of the Labour Party.
I'm talking about Peter Obi of the Labour Party. The fact that he could emerge and in less than a year obtain between 25 and 33% of the electorate. It's a very powerful message. It shows that you don't have to be of the old political elites. It shows that you don't necessarily have to have an old political party to run with. But if your message resonates with the younger generation, you stand a good chance of winning election across this country. And I think that by itself is victory for Peter Obi and his supporters, even if he's not declared the winner of this election. So I think there are positive lessons that can come out of it that capture the dynamism that I see in the younger generation of Africans across this country, and that should be a motivation to those Africans that can lead, that they have to garner the courage to step out if they have a positive message of things that they can do to improve the well-being of their fellow citizens. And there's no doubt in my mind that their fellow citizens would listen and would adhere and would give them the support that they need to be able to access State House and govern in ways that will be different from the ways in which those countries have been governed in the past.
Right. Nigeria is using the single ballot system, and it seems to be working quite well. But in many African countries, including Cameroon, we still have the multiple ballot system with all that it has as cost. And of course, even in terms of organization, in terms of finances, in the printing of the ballot papers and so on. What do you think about the fact that some African countries are still using that single ballot system, whereas the example of Nigeria should be speaking to such countries like Cameroon?
Indeed. I have to say that the single ballot is almost obsolete, because it's not just Nigeria, it's South Africa, it's many countries. I would say the vast majority of African countries have realized the benefits, both economic and political, of the single ballot. Because with the single ballot, vote buying becomes extremely difficult. We know that in the countries where they use multiple ballots, it's very easy for political cronies to say, if you show me the ballots that you didn't use, then I will know who you voted for and I can reward you for that. But with the single ballot, it's economical to print, it's economical to produce, and it makes vote buying very difficult. So I'm surprised that many countries still stick to multiple ballots with all of the inconveniences and all of the cost and the confidence that it saps away from the electoral process. And my hope is that as countries like Cameroon that see the benefits of the single ballot, that they would, or we would continue to perfect our electoral process. And we would realize that electoral reform, even on issues such as the single ballot, are important to build confidence in the electoral process.
What should the other African leaders do as we speak now? Because definitely there are things that are done progressively. The senatorial election will be coming up on the 25th of March in Cameroon. Definitely nothing can be changed about that because it's already close. But there are future election or electoral activities that will be coming up in the next years. 2025 we have the presidential election and probably the other elections also. What should the African leaders begin to do as per the lessons that are coming out of these elections in Nigeria?
Well, to be very blunt, I would say that the process of indirect elections of senators is another. It's archaic. It's an anomaly, which is no longer relevant in today's democracy. You can see here in Nigeria that senators are elected by direct universal suffrage, and they go to the people and they roll out their policies for their states, and the people of their states elect them. Back in Cameroon, we have a system where they're elected by councillors, many of whom were elected through elections that were not even inclusive. And you multiply the illegitimacy around the election of senators. We also, on top of that, as if that was not sufficient by way of a weakness, we have 1/3 of the senators appointed, handpicked by the executive branch or whoever is in State House representing the executive branch. And how do you, in those circumstances, expect the senators to play their legislative oversight role over the executive branch? It's an anomaly, and I don't understand why Cameroon is still even living with that. Those are just the basic things that need to be reformed and changed for us to have a Senate that has any kind of meaning. And the proof is that when you look back from the time when the Senate in Cameroon was put in place till today, if you go into the streets in Douala, in Yaoundé, in Bolova, in Garoua, in Bamenda, or in Boya, and you ask people, what has the Senate of Cameroon accomplished since it was stated, ordinary citizens will be hard-pressed to point to one or two specific assignments. On the contrary, we know there are major issues of national concern, the crisis in the Northwest and the Southwest, the cases of embezzlement and of public resources, the question of freedoms of the press and the assassination of journalists, and we haven't heard a word from the Senate. So it's, you just feel like we are so far behind in putting in place democratic institutions and practices that endure. And there's no reason why other African countries should be so far ahead of us. I hope that we look across the border and we look at a country like Nigeria with all its challenges and what it is doing, and we draw some lessons from there that can help us put in place the right institutions that will respond to the aspirations, the genuine aspirations of younger generation Cameroonians, and also that can build for the future, so that our leaders are not just thinking about themselves and their generation, but they are laying the foundation for future generations. And that's how you build democracy in ways that can endure beyond the generation of the day. I'm also hoping that other African countries look at this and realize that elections are not just a one-day event. It's not just what happened on February 25th or what will happen on March 11th. Elections are a process, a part of the governing process, because if people have confidence in their elections and they participate in the elections, they would have confidence in the legitimacy of those that govern them. And it will be easier for these populations to accept decisions that are made by these leaders, because they would identify in that leadership and they would say, I put him in office, I also can hold him or her accountable. So there's a lot to draw from this, and I hope that well-meaning, democratically inclined African leaders are looking at this and taking notice and will do things that can improve upon the democratic processes in their respective countries.
And one of the things that should be improved upon is the date of publication, or the time that is used to compile and publish the results. Here in Nigeria, it took a little above 72 hours, but people were already complaining everywhere that it has delayed too much. And then when I look back to Cameroon, where we have more than...
Blackout. We have a blackout after every election, and then we have to wait. We have to wait, and then everything has to come out of the capital. Look, if you start unpacking the electoral process here and what happens with the handling of election results, first they are announced at the polling site, and then the results are pasted at each polling site. Then they're taken to the coalition center at the ward level. They're collated from all of the polling units in that ward, and they are announced at that ward and pasted at that ward. And then they go up to the local government area level for coalition of all the wards that are in that local government area. And they're collated and announced at that level. And then they go to the state level, where the state representatives of the election commission then tabulate the elections for that state and actually announce them in the state capital before bringing them to submit to the election commission in Abuja, in the capital. So, unlike in the case of Cameroon, where you never get to know the results of the polling site, let alone the results of the subdivision, how the subdivision went, let alone the results at the divisional level, let alone the results at the regional level, and then you hear the announcement coming from the capital, where the Electoral Commission has accumulated everything. And it becomes extremely difficult to trace backwards to see whether anyone tampered with those results as they were being transmitted from the polling unit through the subdivision to the division to the region to the capital city in Yaoundé. I mean, these are basic elements of transparency that can give confidence to voters that the election results that are being announced in the capital city are a true reflection of what transpired at the local level.
And one very interesting thing is the time. Nigeria with 36 states, with just one of the states, Lagos State, already as big, in terms of population, like Cameroon, the whole of Cameroon, it can still do all this work, and the result is published in 72 hours, or even in less than that length of time. But in Cameroon, it's taking just too long than expected. And then another issue is with the fact that the results put on the internet for people to begin to see as the things are unfolding and so on. But many African countries would hardly do this.
In fact, the reforms that had been enacted into legislation last year in February 2022, and the guidelines that have been put out by INEC were meant to even speed up what was already quite a speedy process. And we're 72 hours away, but people are still unhappy that on the night of the elections, as the polls closed, those election results, especially for the presidential race, were not being made known immediately. You see? So, for the Senate races and the House of Representatives, those results were being known a few hours after the polls closed. And you can see how peaceful the country has been so far, because as the information was coming out, people were cross-checking with the information that they had obtained at their polling units, and they were able to say, oh, X won the Senate seat in my state, and that's legit. So they feel like that's a true transmission of the will of the people. But when you create this opaque system, and you don't announce in 72 hours or in 84 hours, and it takes 5-6 days, the law even says from 7 days or up to 10 days, you create unnecessary anxiety in the population, and you begin to cast doubts as to whether something is happening, that someone is cooking up the elections. There's no reason why a country with 230 million inhabitants, 93 million registered voters, 86 million people collected their voter cards, and they're able to speed up the tabulation and announcement of their election results. And then a country whose voter roll has never gone beyond 6 million cannot do that in a couple of minutes.
Another very interesting thing that I noticed here is that when the results were being proclaimed at the National Collation Center here in Abuja by the different states, the representatives of political parties were given the opportunity by the national chairman of INEC to comment, to react to the results that have been proclaimed, and then point out what they may not agree or what they agree and things like that. And that was quite interesting for me.
Yes, indeed, it was remarkable. And despite the shortcomings that we've identified and talked about, there are things that are working well with Nigeria's democracy that other countries could benefit from emulating. You're right. Being at the data center of the Independent National Election Commission, you saw that the announcements from the states were not being done by the chairman of the Election Commission. He is the returning officer for the entire country. But each state had the returning officer for the state come with their results and be given the opportunity to step forward and say, these are the results that I bring from my state, and to read them out as the returning officer for that state. That, in a place like Cameroon, it looks like it's never happened. And so you have to empower the people who are given the responsibility to run things. We can no longer afford the over-centralization of everything in Cameroon, including the conduct of elections, which should be a people-driven exercise.
Dr. Christopher Fomunyo, thank you so much for your time.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me, and I wish you safe returns back home after coverage of the Nigerian elections.
That's it for this edition of The Insight in Abuja. Thank you so much for staying with us. To have a nice time in the company of our programs. Goodbye.